get a link shared here, and we'll be good to go. All right. Okay. This is our second week of the revived Thursday night Hasidus class. We promised no lecture notes, no textual study, and no holds barred. That was the promise, right? Okay, maybe we should get a cage, make the whole class inside a big cage. This week I would really like to talk about Abraham, because as it says in the Hayom of the Rebbe's calendar, he describes the different parshias, right, at the beginning of the Torah, and he says, Bereshis, the parsha in which the world is created, is a happy Torah portion. At the end, not so great. At the end, it's a bit of a downer. At the end of that portion, you have all sorts of not great things going on, like, for example, the story of Cain and Abel's at the end of that parsha, all sorts of stuff like that. Then you have Parshas Noach. Parshas Noach is a bummer this week. Mostly not such great stuff, the destruction of the world and, mass restart on the project of the universe, so to speak, and all these different things. But the end of the parsha, it says in the Yom, is good, because at the end of the parsha we meet Avram Avinu. And Lech Lecha next week is the first week where the whole parsha is good from the beginning to the end, because we follow the story of Avram, of the first Jew, of Abraham, our forefather, who we traditionally call the first Jew. Abraham's status as the first Jew, by the way, is somewhat contested. It's a debate, it's a machlekes in the Chazal, in the sages, whether Abraham is the first Jew and at what point he becomes the first Jew. And that's how, as my Rosh Hashiva once told me, have I ever told the Thursday night, one of the people who's a regular will let me know, if I've ever told you that my Rosh Hashiva told us that that's how you know that Avram used to wear tzitzis, right? He used to wear the strings. It does ring a bell. I have spoken about it before. I've told you at least. You know that Avram wore tzitzis because Avram, of course, this is only Jews could come up with this idea, by the way. And this is, you won't hear, this is the most Jewish part of tonight's class for sure. Avram, we're taught in the Gemara, kept the entire Torah. But as a non-Jew is not allowed to keep the entire Torah, right? There are certain things that are meant to be specifically like an oath, like a sign of the oath between the Jew and God, that non-Jews who are trying to respect the Torah's wishes explicitly do not do. For example, non-Jews don't keep Shabbos, right? So Avram, of course, because he kept the entire Torah, would have known that the psak in halacha, that his halachic status was that it's a doubt whether he's Jewish or not. It's a debate, right? Because he kept the entire Torah, right? So since he knows that it's a doubt whether he's Jewish or not, he has a problem, because now when it comes to Shabbos, right, does he keep it or does he not keep it? He's not sure if he's Jewish. If he's Jewish, you have to keep it. If you're not Jewish, you have to not keep it. So it's a contradiction. So what do you do? And the answer is that you wear tzitzis, because if you wear tzitzis and you walk outside in the public domain on Shabbos and you're Jewish, you're not carrying, because it's a mitzvah. The strings are a mitzvah and therefore are considered to have importance and be part of the garment that you're wearing, right? So it's not considered carrying them, right? Like you can't carry an umbrella on Shabbos, right? But wearing tzitzis for a Jew is not carrying. But if a non-Jew is to wear tzitzis and they're not commanded to wear them, then if they walk outside in the public domain on Shabbos, it is carrying. And therefore, Abraham, by wearing tzitzis, can fulfill both opinions on himself of whether he is Jewish or not. Ergo, Abraham wore tzitzis. This is an argument that I forget who is the originator of this argument, but it is very, very Jewish. That's one thing that you can put in the bank. It's just coffee, by the way. Not in this synagogue. This is just to make sure I'm awake. That's all. Abraham is the first Jew. The significance of Abraham I should say, the initial significance of Abraham. What makes Abraham special is a broad question. There's a lot of things that make Abraham very special. But the first thing that makes Abraham special is that Abraham rediscovers the one God, right? In Judaism, if you ask an academic, right, if you think about secular histories, you may have heard, secular anthropologies of the world, right, where they talk about different people from different places going back in time, right? The general secular consensus, although by no means, by the way, a unanimous consensus, but the general secular consensus, like you would hear from a university or you would read in a book, or you read in a regular secular encyclopedia, you'd read on Wikipedia, is that people and societies generally start as idolatrous societies, as worshiping many deities. And then later, as they become more advanced, those idolatries begin to cohere into a single God. Some anthropologists have even extended this back into animals, by the way, and argue that the whole thing is an evolutionary process, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have to go into everything that that it says on Wikipedia, but the bottom line is that in Judaism, we believe that mankind starts with monotheism. In other words, Adam, the first person, the first man, the first of our species, speaks to God directly and knows God directly, and he teaches his children about God. His children also speak to God, by the way. Our religion, you see that his sons are monotheists and worship God. It's in the Torah. Which leaves Judaism with a question that Wikipedia doesn't have to answer. Judaism's question that is not a question for Wikipedia is, so how does it become that when Abraham is a little boy, as all the Jewish kids learn in Hebrew school, right, he grows up worshiping idols. His father is an idolater, right? Arami Eve Davi, right? In the Haggadah, we talk about how our ancestors were idolaters and worshipped idols, right? So you have to explain what happens between Adam and Avram, Adam and Abraham, of how idolatry arises. And it's not really the topic of our class, but I'll tell you the short version of the story is that I already actually was telling someone else about it this week. The short version of the story is that is recorded by Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah at the beginning of the laws of idol worship. The Rambam writes the history of Avodah Zarah, the history of idolatry, of idol worship. And the Rambam explains how idol worshippers start worshiping Hashem. They start worshiping the one God. And then they see that God has appointed and created, for example, the sun, right? God creates the sun that grows the crops, right? And it's the sun that helps the crops grow, right? So what they figure is, as the Rambam describes it, of course God is God, but the sun also deserves thanks, right? The way it's put in the rabbinic literature is, if you have a banquet, and you have a host, right? You don't just say thank you to the host of the banquet. You also say thank you to your waiter, right? When he pours you your wine. So similarly, God is the host of everything. He's the highest God, but then you also have all these things that he's appointed, which have these roles in nature: the sun, the moon, the rain, right? In Egypt, famously, the Nile River was their idolatry, right? Because the Nile was the source of all of their food. The Nile would overflow on a periodically, and it would irrigate their fields very famously, as it does to this day, and water all their fields. So the reasoning was that if God, even though God is the one God, he's appointed this bureaucracy, right? He's appointed basically lower level beings, and they also deserve thanks. And once you start saying they also deserve thanks, then you start thinking more. And you say, well, if they deserve thanks, maybe giving them more thanks will get us more benefits, right? In other words, let's be really nice to the local government, right? And they'll make things nice for us here in our town, and we don't have to bother, we don't have to bother the president of the United States. It doesn't have to make everything a federal issue, as they say, right? Well, be nice to the local government, pray to the sun, right? Give thanks to the sun, and the sun for us, this is too big an issue for the big God, right? And from there, you can see how that goes from level to level until you basically reach a point where God is irrelevant. And once God is irrelevant, what do you need him for? What do you need to believe in him for at all? This is the process as described in the Rambam. And every time I describe this to someone in the Rambam, I point out to them, and it's imperative to point out, that even though in a lot of Jewish thinking, idolatry, a lot of modern thinking, idolatry is seen as very backwards, simple-minded, right? Very barbaric in a way, you could even say, if you could say such a word, right? The Rambam story is quite different. Maimonides' description of idolatry says that it was the thinkers, right, who didn't take things at face value. It was the thinkers, the investigators, the dreamers, the philosophers. They were the ones that began idolatry. It wasn't a mistake of the simple people. It was a mistake of people who said, well, there's God, but there's also a son. Let's think about this. Let's think who we have to give thanks to, right? So on the contrary, idolatry is a mistake in reason, according to the Rambam, which is going to be very important to the general theme of our class in a moment. As Maimonides describes it, the generations descend until Abraham has never heard of the one God. So is the story. There are people who believe in the one God and are monotheists, by the way, at the time that Abraham is there. In fact, the Ibn Ezra says that how do you remember how old Abraham was when Noach himself passed away? It's the name Noach. Noach is 58, right? So Noah himself was 58 years old when Abraham passed away. They were actually contemporaries for many years. Noah was alive. However, Abraham was not apparently in touch with Noah. No, Abraham was 50. Did I say that? Abraham was 58 when Noach passed away. They shared 58 years together on this earth. But Noah apparently, and also his sons and even his grandchildren, right? There's a famous yeshiva always mentioned in the Midrash when we talk about the forefathers called the yeshiva of Shem and Ever, right? There was this whole monotheistic tradition that existed in the world, but not to Abraham. Abraham had moved, his family was obviously not in that part of the world or not exposed to that. Abraham's children, etc., got back in touch with that tradition later and went to study with those masters. But Abraham himself, as a child, is raised with idols. All the students learn in Hebrew school. It's very important. The things in general that we teach in Hebrew school are generally the most important things that anyone has to know in general, right, in life. It's like the guy wrote the book, Everything I Need to Know in Life I Learned in Kindergarten, right? So the same is true with the stories that the little kids learn when they're 6 years old at Hebrew school. That's basically everything you need to know in general. And Chassidus' view of this is particularly emphatic on this point, right? Everything we learn is just to reach the level of the stories from the Midrash that the kids learn in the Hebrew school. So as all the kids who go to the Hebrew school know, Abraham's father has a shop where he sells idols, and they worship idols. Idols are us. And Abraham's father goes away one day, and the young upstart Abraham smashes many of the idols with something like a club or a shepherd's crook or something like that. This is all as recorded in the Midrash. And Abraham puts the club in the hands of the biggest idol in the store. When his father comes back, his father says, what happened here? And he says, Father, the biggest idol destroyed all of the other idols. And the father says, you fool, the idol can't, I know that the idol didn't move or wasn't able to smash anything. And Abraham says, exactly, gotcha, Dad. Which in general is a very mysterious story, which we'll investigate more in just a moment. At what age did this happen? There's all sorts of different opinions. There's many different opinions of the chronology of Abraham's life. I have to confess to you, this is also my second time confessing this week to someone, that I am mildly obsessed with the biography of Abraham. Mildly. I'm very, very interested in Abraham. Abraham fascinates me. He's a fascinating character. There's so much and so much richness to his story. And when you learn the Hasidic teachings, and especially the Rebbe's talks about Abraham, you get a whole very profound progression and biography, like a spiritual biography almost of Abraham, where he came from, where he ended up. And he, of course, was the first Jew and the father of the entire nation. So rather an important person. So there's many different disagreements about how old Abraham was when he found God. The youngest age that's given is 3. He begins to think when he's 3. This is what the Rambam says. The Rambam says, I don't think the Rambam mentions he was 3, but the Rambam says when he was very young, he already started having questions, so to speak. He was a questioner, what we would call maybe nowadays. This would make some religious Jews uncomfortable, so I'm contractually obligated to say it. Therefore, right, that the Abraham was a radical progressive of his time and his society. Right, Abraham, the first Jew's first recorded act is smashing idols. Right, Chaim to that.
Has anybody written about what these idols look like?
Looked like, I'm not sure. A little bit about the nature of the idolatry of that time we do have, both from secular and religious sources. I believe if you go in secular sources, they would tell you that the cult that was most prominent in ancient Mesopotamia at around the time when Abraham was there, that we know about anyway, which is a big caveat, is the... There was a moon cult, there was a sun cult, and they worshipped and made idols. The truth is, I have no idea what they look like. It's a very good question. I don't know. Perhaps it is recorded in even rabbinic sources. I just don't know anything about it. It's very possible. The Midrash or the Talmud, one of them says that Avram Avinu had many, many tractates of Avodah Zarah. Right? I don't think it means literally, but in other words, the Babylonian Talmud, we have one volume called Avodah Zarah, called Idol Worship, right? Which is based on, of course, the Mishnah, which is one volume called Idol Worship, the laws of idolatry and the negation of idolatry in Judaism, right? So it says that Avram Avinu had many, many, many times more. In other words, the amount of idolatry and the quality of the idolatry and the total obsession with idolatry that existed in those times is something that we have a hard time relating to today. Something that the Torah itself explains in many ways, by the way. The Torah is of the express opinion that the spiritual nature of society and civilization changes and goes through phases. We very much believe in something like what the Germans call the Zeitgeist, right? The Zeitgeist, which means the spirit of the times, right? There's times when something is in and there's times when something is out. For example, when you learn about what the Babylonians were doing, what the Persians were doing in the story of Purim, and what the Greeks were doing in the story of Hanukkah, two different exiles, two different civilizations, two different challenges to Judaism, right? Different, in many ways, different qualities, different approaches, different actions, right? The Egyptian exile had a certain quality, all of which is, the Torah explains a lot of this at great length, right? In different rabbinic sources and things like that. Abraham, the Talmud describes, I'm getting just a little off track, but it's okay, I remember where the departure took place. The Talmud describes that the sages diminished purposefully the desire to worship idols in their time. They captured the inclination, whatever this means. Not only did they capture, first they incarnated it. In other words, they brought forth the spirit of evil into a physical form. So I'm just telling you what the Talmud says, right? And they wanted, because it was in their clutches, they realized it was a time of great spiritual power where they could capture the spirit of evil, so to speak. And it says that they wanted to destroy it entirely, but they realized they wanted to, so they basically prevented it from having any effect. And the Talmud says what happens is that the chickens stop laying eggs in the market, which is a very interesting piece of Talmud. It's actually very relevant to Chabad philosophy, right? Because this, you see here a basic idea, even in the Talmud, of the idea that evil and animality, right, reproduction, the natural working of survival of biological life, right, is somehow associated with the evil inclination, right? And the Tanya explains in great length that there's an animal soul, and in the animal soul is where lives the evil inclination, the self-destructive, self-immolating tendency in humankind. Anyway, for those who are students of Tanya, that may have interested you. So instead of killing it or destroying the spirit of evil, which would have destroyed the world, right? It's woven into the tapestry of the world, unfortunately, right? As we found out. They put out its eye, if I recall the story correctly. And what happened is the desire for idol worship and the desire for incestuous relations within one's family were what greatly decreased as a result of this spiritual motion. Around the same time, one of the Hasidic masters, I forget which one, notes, maybe Rav Tzadok HaKohen from Lublin, one of the great Hasidic masters notes that it was at the same time that there was a decrease in prophecy. In other words, the descent from the desire for idol worship, the fact that since that time we haven't desired to worship idols in the same way, was concomitant with, it happened at the same time as the decrease in the spirit of prophecy in the world. These two things go together, which kind of makes a sort of intuitive sense, because as I told you before, idolatry is not a stupidity. Idolatry is a profound spirituality, a mistaken spirituality, but a profound philosophy and spirituality that simply went the wrong way. So if you're lessening the spiritual mistake that will lead people to do idolatry, right, you also are distancing them from the sensitivity that is required for the higher levels of prophecy. Anyway, it's just something it says in the Talmud. I'm sure I did not quote it correctly, but the rules are no lecture notes for this class. It says on the advertisement.
Are you putting all idol workers on the same level?
No.
Or different levels?
No, there's many different levels. No, not at all. Why do you ask your question? What level, what distinctions are you thinking of?
Because I know, at least from my knowledge,
Yeah.
Since they couldn't approach God, because God is not visible, they approached something that was actually made by God.
Yeah.
That's how they started to believe.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I see that as one category said, okay, God forbid it, and maybe people look at the sun, oh, this is a great thing.
Yeah.
Let's believe it.
Yeah.
But when you talk about those which are made out of clay, man-made, how can you believe in this?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's a very good question. I'll actually have something to say about that in just a little while here. It's a very good question. And there are levels. In fact, the Rambam says that it went Medechi el Dechi, right? It started very lofty, and then by the time you reach Avram, and the Rambam says it wasn't just intellectual descent. It was also, there were also false prophets and people basically that saw that they could become powerful or make money or all sorts of natural human evils that took advantage of this idolatrous impulse, and it just kept dragging it lower and lower and lower, right? Until the it's like cryptocurrency. It is a little bit like cryptocurrency. I don't entirely disagree. I'm not sure if we'd agree in the same way. Maybe that's the same way, but it is, and I agree. There's a connection. Anyway, the Abraham is in a society that is very, very inclined to worship idols. And he becomes the Ivri. The Ivri, we learn later in the Torah, means, which is the source of the word Hebrew, right? Ivri in the simple language means he comes from across the river, right? Because he came across the Euphrates, right? From Mesopotamia to the land of Canaan, to Israel, right? But Ivri in the rich meaning, in the rabbinic interpretation, the Ivri means the other sider, right? The whole world was on one side, and Abraham was on the other. I think Jews in recent weeks maybe can relate to the sentiment maybe a little bit. But the Avraham was on one side, the whole world was on the other side, and that's the first thing that's significant about Avraham Avinu. In other words, God does not reveal Himself to Abraham at all for almost 100 years. For a long time. So Avram's much older, right? God doesn't reveal Himself to Avram. There's no prophecy, right? Avram figures this all out on his own, and he's the first person in history to do so. That is the initial thing that is significant about Abraham. Abraham is the first Jewish philosopher. What's a philosopher? Philosopher is a term in Judaism. It's an official term. It has a halachic definition. It has a Torah definition, a cheker Yisrael, right? A Jewish philosopher, a philosopher in Judaism. A philosopher starts with the world and works their way to an understanding of God. That's what a philosopher does, and that's exactly what Abraham did. Abraham looked at the world around him, and his thought processes, which are, again, fascinating, are recorded in the Midrash, as are his debates with the idolaters of his time. He debated a king whose name was Nimrod, and they have a whole intellectual debate, and Nimrod wins the debate by throwing him in a furnace. That's Nimrod's trump card.
Nimrod knew about God, and he was rebelling against him.
Yeah. The initial idolaters all know about God, right? The higher levels of idolatry, right? In fact, what we nowadays call atheism in Judaism would be considered a very, very, very low level of idolatry, way past where it descends into sub-rationality. In other words, right? We could do a whole class just on what is atheism on the Jewish view, which would be a very interesting thing. In Judaism, atheism is and always has been a very, what's the word? It's a very parochial concern. You know what it means, parochial? Like on the edges, like out there, there's some like few people, right, who really have this belief and have this issue. Whereas idolatry, by contrast, right, idolatry is the central concern of Judaism. Idolatry is the second of the Ten Commandments, for example, right? Idolatry is, the Talmud says, right, who's the first person in history that's called a Jew? You know the answer to this. The first person in history who's called a Jew. Mordechai Yehudi. Mordechai in the story of the Megillah is the first time someone in the book of Esther is the first time someone is called a Jew. The Talmud finds this very ironic. Why? Because he's a Benjaminite. He's not a Jew. Jew comes from Judah, descendant of Yehuda, the son of Yaakov. Mordechai is not a Jew. He's not a Judaic. He's not a descendant of Judah. He's a descendant of Benjamin. He's from a different tribe. So asks the Talmud, why do we call him a Yehudi? Why do we call him a Jew? And the Talmud says, anyone that's kefer ba'avodah zara is called Yehudi. Anyone who is a heretic against idol worship, right, is called a Jew. So in other words, the Talmud's definition of it, what is a Jew, right? A Jew is, I'm not an idolater. That's what a Jew is in the Talmud. It's a very interesting question. It's an interesting question.
Well, that definition was right before the Muslims, right? That they could have put it that way, but now I don't think this is going to be the definition.
Chasidei Umas Ha'olam. It's a long story. It's a good question. You understand the question. The question is, there's other monotheistic faiths, right? So obviously you would say, when they're certainly not idolaters. That's not the answer, for sure not, right? If someone is following Islam correctly, they're certainly not an idolater. In fact, according to many opinions in halacha, it's even permitted for Jews to go into a mosque, which is not true for a house of idol worship, right? But how that relates to this Gemara is an interesting question. I don't know. It's something to think about. I have a feeling I know the answer, but I don't want to get into it now. It's a good question. The Talmud defines a Jew as being anti-idolatry. In other words, atheism is like it's something that nebuch can happen to, 3 out of 1 million people, they have this issue, right? It doesn't sound like nowadays, right? That's part of the confusion, because first you have to define atheism and you have to define Judaism and how Judaism defines atheism, and then you'll see how this works, right? But like I said, it could be a whole other class. But Judaism is much more concerned with idolatry. The difference between idolatry and atheism at the simplest level is that in idolatry, you still believe God exists, right? It's not about denying that God ultimately exists, right? Many would argue, for example, that the Greeks are enemies on Hanukkah, right? The Greeks fundamentally, many would argue, at least at the height of their civilization, when they came to clash with the Jews and the Maccabees, right? Many would argue that the Greeks did have a conception of monotheism. If you study Greek philosophy, as for example the Rambam did, and the Rambam talks about Aristotle all the time in the Moreh Nevuchim and the Guide for the Perplexed. If you study Aristotle not only has a conception of God, Aristotle believes he has found ironclad intellectual proof that God exists even, right? There is a certain concept of God in Greek philosophy. However, their beliefs are still totally idolatrous. The two are not in contradiction. It's not about, again, remember how the Rambam said the whole thing started, right? The whole thing starts by saying thank you to the Son also, not by saying God doesn't exist, right? So that's really, to understand what idolatry is, that would be the beginning of the class on idolatry. You have to understand that a real idolater believes in God as well. That's not what it's about. It's not about the number of beings. It's not like in Judaism it's one, and in idolatry it's more than one. That's not the difference. It's a whole other story. Anyway, this class is about, the title of this class is How Abraham Discovers God, right? Abraham discovers God, as we said, through philosophy. The Midrash records his what he says. There's a very interesting Midrash, very famous Midrash, which you may have heard of in Bereshis Rabbah, in the most central and famous and main rabbinic work on these parshas. It describes there how Abraham's discovery of God was like someone who was walking down the road and he saw a bira doilekas, right? Which different interpretations interpreted two different ways. You could say either a tower that was on fire, right? Or you could say a tower that was illuminated, right? That was illuminated, lit up, right? And the Midrash says, how can there be a tower but no master to the tower, right? Then he realized there must be yesh balabayas lebirazu is the famous quote, right? There is a master of this tower. And then the Midrash continues, and then the master of the tower, in the first verse of next week's Parsha, this is the Midrash's description of Lech Lecha, right? It says, what's Lech Lecha? Lech Lecha is Abraham's been seeing this tower that's either illuminated or burning, and he's been telling himself for years and years and years, there must be someone that owns this tower. And then God, the master of the tower, comes and says, hello. The master of the tower shows his face all of a sudden, right? And he says, what's up, Abe? Right? That's Lech Lecha. Lech Lecha is that Abraham has a prophecy, which in other words, it's not just Abraham intellectually knows that God is there. God actually begins to talk to Avram. And that's actually the first story of Avram that's mentioned in the Torah. All of this other stuff is all from the rabbinic literature, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason why the Torah story of Avram begins with his prophecy and not with any of his earlier achievements. Sorry, you wanted to say something? The Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe of Chabad, grandson of the author of the Tanya, writes in his in a mimer, in a Hasidic discourse, he writes that the entire arguments for the existence of God that you can find in the Rambam and the Ralbag. The Rambam Maimonides, the Ralbag Gersonides, one of the great Jewish Jewish philosophers, viewed in retrospect by many as almost a proto-modern kind of figure. That's a whole other discussion. But these two Jewish philosophers wrote involved books of Jewish philosophy, like the Rambam's famous Guide for the Perplexed, which, by the way, if you've ever tried to read it and tried to study it, you would know that it's not so simple. The Rambam's perplexed person, as the Rambam himself warns in his introduction, is not the standard person who has questions about God. The Rambam was writing for a very scholarly and elite audience, and the Guide for the Perplexed, without someone to teach it to you or a very good commentary or something like that, it can be like reading Greek, actually. A lot like reading a foreign language. Very difficult and challenging books. And the Rambam, at great length, in the second part of Moreh Nevuchim, deals with proving the existence of God and the nature of God according to Judaism, which is a philosophical pursuit. He relies on this primarily on Aristotle. He uses Aristotle's method, adapted to his own needs. So the Tzemach Tzedek writes, the Ralbag I have not studied. The Rambam I've seen it a little bit. The Ralbag I have not studied myself. So I don't know what the Ralbag says about the existence of God. But the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, studied both, obviously. And he writes in his Hasidic discourse that the lengthy proofs in Maimonides and in Gersonides for the existence of God can all be found within these few lines of Midrash about the tower that's either burning or illuminated, right? I would like to just examine briefly what we mean when we say that this was Avram's steps for realizing the reality of God. Like I said, I'm obsessed with Avram. There's many more midrashim which flesh out his intellectual approach and all of these things. There's much more about it in the rabbinic literature, but we don't have time for everything. So I wanted to let's focus on this one thing, right? So they're both proofs. They're both the way that Avram found God, right? There's two different ways of reading it. The Tzemach Tzedek, I think, I'm not positive. I believe that Tzemach Tzedek is reading it that the tower is illuminated, not burning. And I'll explain to you why I think that in a moment. But the way of reading it, when you say that that the man was walking on the road and he saw that a tower was burning or on fire, right? The idea is that Abraham sees there's so much suffering and there's so much destruction and so many terrible things in the world, right? And this leads him to his appreciation of God, right? The tower is burning. Surely there must be someone that's responsible for this, right? That's the one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it, and really I think the two ways are related. I don't think they're necessarily entirely different one from the other, by the way. The other way of looking at it is the tower is illuminated. In other words, Avram sees order. If you're walking down the road and you see a tower and you see it's not a ruin, right? It has signs of habitation. It has signs of orderliness. There's someone that's lived here. It's illuminated, right? There's torches and they're burning. Clearly, there must be someone that lives here. This is not like an abandoned, this didn't just happen. There's clearly an inhabitant here, right? Which is a very interesting metaphor, habitation, right? There are all sorts of, I leave it for homework. You can think about the implications, because in habitation, it means that the person that you're looking for lives within it, but you can't see them, right? It's not that they're somewhere else. They're here, and that you can see their effects, but you can't see them, right? Abraham's an argument based on the idea. What will you find in the Rambam, for example, right? If you look at the Rambam's demonstration of the existence of God, and how would that connect with, because the Tzemach Tzedek says it's found in the Midrash, right? And how would that connect with this illuminated tower? So I'll explain it to you very briefly. There's something philosophically that's called, it has a scary philosophical name, but it's really not very scary at all. It's called the teleological argument in English, right? From the Greek word telos. I don't know if I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but that's okay. Butchering philosophy is a Jewish pastime. It's not a problem. Butchering Greek philosophy. The Aristotle will forgive us. The teleological proof. In Hebrew, the word is tachlis, right? You would say it's the proof from tachlis. What's tachlis? Purpose, right? Purpose, direction, culmination, you could translate if you're being very fancy, right? It's the tachlis, it's the goal, it's the purpose, the end goal. End, you could say in English, end-directedness, intentionality. There's all different words you could use, right? Tachlis. Tachlis means, let's talk tachlis, let's talk bottom line, is what tachlis means, right? The argument is as follows: you see a tower, and you see that someone's living there, and you see that it's very orderly. What does orderliness mean? It's a very good question. We could talk about it all night and not have an answer. What is orderly? What does it mean for something to be orderly, that you can tell that someone lives there, right? As opposed to chaotic. It means there's a certain sense to it, right? Right, okay. What does it mean there's a certain sense to something? Yeah, what does it mean something has logic to it as opposed to chaos, right? So in the end, I believe the answer is more or less, roughly, or I believe at least the way perhaps the Rambam would have seen it, right, is that what it means is that there's something like my mind out there in the world. That's really what it means, right? My mind and the world fit together, which is a fair definition of rationality, if anyone is, right? Rationality means that things make sense. There's order, right? My mind and the world somehow fit together in a way that's very, that for lack of a better term, seems obvious and directly, almost directly observable to us, to someone that has a mind, right? My mind and the world fit together. So you're walking along the road and you see this tower, and you see that this tower is like my thinking, which means it's like me. It's like a mind. There's something like a mind that has to do with this tower, right? And then you realize that, well, bricks, as far as I know, don't have a mind, and mortar doesn't have a mind, right? There must be some kind of inherent mindness that comes from a mind that can be put into brick and mortar, that can make it into a certain thing. So you could go searching for the source of that mind, right? And when you found that mind, you would also find, when you find the person that built the tower, you would see that they themselves are put together just like the tower, right? They themselves are put together with a certain order. The human being himself, right, seems to follow a certain rational path, right? So you would say, who put this together? And you would go back and back and back in your thinking, as the Midrash describes Avram doing, by the way. Nimrod asks him, maybe we should worship fire. And Avram says, well, water could put out fire. And he says, well, maybe we should worship water. And he says, no, the clouds, they carry the water. He says, okay, let's worship the cloud, right? In the end, Nimrod says, you know what, we're going to stick with fire, the first one we said. I'm almost directly quoting to you. And that's when he throws him in the furnace, right? Publicly embarrassing the ancient Mesopotamian dictator, something I don't recommend any of you try at home. Eventually, this chain where you realize that everything has an inherent orderliness to it, right? Has an inherent directedness to it, right? Is not just orderly, but even is directed towards producing something, right? This tower is for living in. You can see it. You can see that someone lives here, right? That inherent directedness, right? That chain of things that are directed has to end in something that explains itself. And this you call God, right? That's roughly the argument. I'm not here to debate whether this argument is correct, and there's many. We could do a whole night just on this argument, right? What does this mean? Is it true? Does this actually find God? I personally, by the way, as I gave a class on Shavuos here a few years ago, it's unlikely anyone remembers, but I did give a class once, there's no recording of it because it was on Yom Tov, about how I don't think that there is any philosophical argument in the Jewish view, in the Hasidic view, that actually does prove that God exists. It's not a philosophy thing. Philosophy proves something, but it doesn't necessarily prove God. It can also be another class we do here if anyone's interested. The point is that through lines of reasoning like this, right, very philosophical reasoning, Avram discovers God. And in this, Avram is very different than Noah, who most of this week's Torah portion is about, because Noah has a face-to-face relationship with God, and from his youth, he learned about God. Noah was raised with the concept of God, we learn. Noah was not a philosopher. He wasn't a free thinker. On the contrary, he's raised in this path. And this actually answers the question, the Rebbe explains, this answers the question of, there's a famous Rashi at the beginning of this week's Parsha where we say, if Noach had lived in the generation of Avram, maybe he wouldn't have been that significant. To which the Rebbe asks the klutz kasha, as we call it in Yiddish, which means the question that's so obvious that many people miss it, which is that they lived in the same generation, right? Noah died when Abraham was 58 already, as we said at the beginning, right? And the answer is that a generation of Avram is not when Avram is alive. A generation of Avram is when he has taught many people to be like himself, right? That they themselves are able to intellectually understand and find God in their own way. That's the generation of Avram, which explains how Noach had already passed away before Avram had made it his generation, so to speak, even though he was alive. So,
when you talk about the Parsha, so it says that Noach italach et Hashem. That means Noach knew God. But in the other way, there's a different approach between Abraham and Noah, because Noah was approached by God, but Abraham actually discovered God.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly right.
So Abraham italach לפני Hashem. Right. Noah italach et Hashem.
No, but
different definitions.
I'm just telling you what the Midrashim say. You're right about the pasuk. I don't know about how to reconcile the pasuk. It's a good question. I don't know. Presumably, the pasuk, according to this, would mean something else. I don't know the verse. How does the Rambam, I just have to say this before I get to my final point here. The Rambam does note, he finishes his story of the development of idolatry by saying that eventually, even though Abraham finds God, and you have Isaac and Jacob, who are also pretty God-fearing people, to put it mildly, their descendants eventually fall back into idolatry in Egypt, right? As we know, famous story. In fact, they even when they left Egypt, they brought an idol with them. Very into idolatry in Egypt, as the Rambam describes. And he says that's why in the end God sends Moses, and Moses comes and takes them out of Egypt, and he brings them to Mount Sinai, and he gives them the Torah. That's the end of the Rambam's story. Why is the end of the story very important? The end of the story is very important because, in a way, just as Avraham was the first Jewish philosopher, in a way, Avraham was also the last Jewish philosopher. Because the Jewish approach to finding God is that first we listen to Moses and Mount Sinai, and second we're philosophers, right? The Rambam's point is that Avram's approach did not hold. It wasn't eternal. It wasn't the eternal way in finding God, right? Avram was better than Noach. Why? Because Avram was able to integrate God with his own understanding, and he did it on his own with no help, right? Which is very impressive. It shows a very profound connection to God when you own it, right? But on the other hand, there's also a weakness to the approach of knowing God only intellectually. The weakness is, the way Hasidus would put it is, that if you recall, how did the argument for how Abraham found God, he said there's something out there, right? Meaning the order of the world, right? That's like me, that's like my mind, right? And Hasidus would say, so that means the God you're going to find through this process will only ever be connected to your mind, not to your whole self, not to your etzem, right? The Jewish way, when God is connected to your etzem, is through emunah, right? Jews are maminim b'nei maminim, believers, the sons of believers. Jews believe in God because a Jew, by definition, means that God exists. Or as I ended my Shavuos class, that class about the proofs of God, right? The Jewish approach to the existence of God is to ask God whether he exists and hold by that answer, right? In other words, the Jewish non-belief is, as we discussed last week's class, right? Jewish non-belief, like Golda Meir, right, is also belief, right? Jewish non-belief is also belief. Why? Because to be a Jew, and the story of the Jew is the story that means God inherently, right? That's exactly by design. That's exactly as the Rambam describes. We negate idolatry because Moses took us out of Egypt, and once you have that connection, right? Every person is supposed to also, to the best of their ability, intellectually understand God. You're supposed to have both qualities, but in a Jew, a Jew is not. Sometimes it's necessary if they didn't get the grounding in their faith that they should have gotten, which nowadays, unfortunately, is very common, maybe even universal. There's no real Jewish education the way it's meant to be done, possibly nowadays anymore. But so sometimes it's necessary to use philosophy and to explain God and to find God in the way of Avram to some extent, perhaps. But even then, we mostly nowadays, the real way to find God, the Jewish way to find God, is not with the mind, it's with the very essence of the soul, right? It's through being Jewish that a Jew relates to and connects to God, as we discussed in last week's class. In my remaining 10 minutes here, I'd like to make just one final interesting observation to you. The Jews who had the rational Abrahamic belief in God and then fell into idolatry. By the way, that's not so literal either, because you see with the stories of Yitzchak and Yaakov that it wasn't also intellectual anymore. But let's say that the Hebrews who went down, the Ivrim, the 70 souls, who went down to Egypt, and then eventually the tribes passed away and Yosef passed away and they all fell into idolatry, right? They knew intellectually the arguments for God, right? So the question is, what happened? Because for the whole story that we've told so far, right, idolatry was an intellectual mistake. Abraham had a very piercing intellect, a very piercing a philosophical mind, where he looked beyond the surface of things to perceive that there's a God behind the world, that one God who is the creator and runs the world. And he was able to perceive this with his profound intellect. And he negated the mistakes of Nimrod, right? He negated the mistakes of the idolaters. And in fact, the Torah says that Avram's arguments, on the strength of his arguments, he gained thousands of adherents, right? His students, who we learn about all the time in the Midrash and in the Torah, the students of Avram were all one intellectually, right? They were all convinced by Avram. Certainly, the early students were convinced by Avram that God existed. It wasn't mitzvayim. It wasn't wrapping tefillin. There was no tefillin to wrap on them. Tefillin didn't exist yet, right? And besides, tefillin wouldn't work because the whole principle of wrapping tefillin on people in the street is that you're waking up the soul that they have that already has a connection to God. Avram doesn't have that benefit, right? These aren't Jews he's dealing with. Avram is Judaism doesn't exist. The Torah hasn't been given on Mount Sinai, right? Judaism hasn't civilized civilization yet, right? So he has to argue. He has to explain to them why God exists, and they listen, right? Yeah, but the Birkat HaMazon story, if you learn what that story means, you'll see it's the same idea, right? In other words, all of these different ways, but at the end of the day, it's not about waking up faith. It's about breaking through intellectually to someone. That's really what that story is about. Sometimes to break through to someone, it requires a bit of a zetz, as we would say in Yiddish, a bit of a bitush. And there's a whole other story we could do a whole class on that as well. I hope someone's noting all of these things I say we could do a whole class on. The what? It's recorded. Someone has to go through the recording and remember what's said once in a class that I give. That would be nice. Anyway, the idolatry is an intellectual mistake. Abraham rectifies it, so to speak. He finds the truth of God and is very convincing. Certainly, he would have told his deepest insights to his children, presumably, right? So what goes wrong? How do they fall back into idolatry? If idolatry is an intellectual mistake, right? Right? Once you know the right, it's not like we learn in school that 2 + 2 = 4. You could think as a 5-year-old that 2 + 2 = 5. Your teacher explains to you in a very logical way that even a 5-year-old mind can understand, because it's not very difficult, that 2 and 2 is 4, not 5, right? And never again in your whole life for a healthy human being does a human being have a problem with that, right? Or you could learn in geometry class in high school that the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, is correct. And you might learn the proof and demonstration of that. And once you learn the proof and demonstration, you don't even need to remember the proof and demonstration anymore, because some people don't remember the theorem also. But the point is that no one needs to, it's not like you're being tempted and falling into doubts about the Pythagorean theorem, most people, right? Maybe some insane philosopher whose job is to question mathematical conclusions, and that's how you get like an Einstein or something like that. But the average person, right, he was doing it as an exercise to break the boundary, advance the boundaries of human knowledge. That's a different story. The average person, for their own belief, has no issue with 2 + 2 = 4, and their whole life, the nail only needs to be hammered in one time. It doesn't need multiple. Why is the belief in God not like that, right? The answer is obvious, right? Because the temptation to Avodah Zarah is not really an intellectual temptation. The story I gave you before is more complicated than it first appears, right? I said it's an intellectual mistake. Avram fixed it. If it was only an intellectual mistake, it would have stayed fixed, right? Why does it fall into ruin again? Because the reason is, obviously, it's not purely intellectual, right? But then, if it's not purely intellectual, and there's the crooked timbers of humanity, as they would say, can lead a person to worshiping false gods and can drag a person into the darkness of the idolatrous cult, right? And if all of that can happen, then you have to go back to Avram, right? So we would say in the Talmud, Hadjar Kashi Leduchta, right? What was so great about Avram's intellectual appreciation of God, right? The truth is, the negation of idolatry was not intellectual, right? What's so great about Avram, the intellectual? We said that the initial greatness of Abraham is he discovers God on his own. Well, it turns out, you could argue, maybe he just wasn't as tempted. Maybe Abraham was privileged, right? Maybe he was born with a certain genetic code that made him not inclined to bow down to idols, whereas everyone around him was, right? Or inclined him to be crazy and like an Einstein and ask weird questions, where everyone else around you doesn't question it at all, right? So, but if that was the case, then we couldn't claim that Avram was this great philosopher and came to this great conclusion. You would just say he's privileged, right? Understand the question? You understand the question? I believe very deeply that in Judaism, we do not trust the rational intellect. If you read any Musar Sefer, if you read any book of Jewish ethics, right, it will discuss how the human intellect is very, very easily turned in a different direction, right? It's what we would call fallacies, bias, personal interest, right? And this, what the Musar Sfarim say, is not their own invention. You find this in the Talmud, right? There was a certain Talmudic sage whose name I would remember if I was allowed to take notes for this class. He he was a judge, right? And basically the Talmud tells a story of how someone gave him did him the slightest favor, which wasn't even a real favor. It was like almost a nothing favor. And years later, he was in that guy, or a long time later, I don't want to say years, I'm probably going to ruin the whole story. Later, this guy was in a court case, and the Jewish judge, the judge recused himself. And this is in fact the law in halacha, in a real halachic beis din, in a real Sanhedrin. Right, the judge has to have nothing to do with the defendant in the positive or the negative. Even the slightest favor, right, could be considered something that messes up objective judgment, right? And here you're talking about a sage of the Talmud who was probably a tzaddik with no yetzer hara, and he was still worried about himself, right, with no evil inclination, and one of the holiest rabbis we can conceive of, right? And yet he did not trust himself with this matter. This was something he would not do, right? Because the rational mind is so easily turned from its path, which makes the question even stronger, right? Of how can there be such a thing as a real Jewish philosopher that you get full credit of discovering God intellectually, right? Maybe Abraham's idolatrous father was mean to him when he was a child, and that's why he found God. You know what I'm saying? It's not, how can you say that there's this sort of, this whole idea of like dispassionate, objective intellect being able to reach grand conclusive conclusions is very Greek, not very Jewish, is the truth. If you learn the Talmud, it doesn't work like that. I'll give you another example, right? And this example actually has the answer to the question. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel in the Talmud, always arguing, famous disputants with each other, always arguing. Beis Shammai, the house of Shammai, and the house of Hillel, right? Usually who's right? Beis Hillel. There's a few, it depends. Okay. I can see I'm on the verge of getting in trouble. I'm on thin ice, Lachan. They both speak the words of the living God, and in that sense they are both right, as the scholars present note correctly. However, who is the halacha normally like? Who does the law normally follow? Beis Hillel, right? Sometimes, in a few places, the halacha follows Shammai. One of those places is my favorite debate of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai over whether it's better that man had been created or not been created, in which case Shammai wins the argument. Conclusively, it would have been better for man if he hadn't been created. One of my favorite pieces of Talmud, which can also be a whole class. The Gemara explains why does Hillel normally win. Right. In different places, it gives different reasons, right? But there's one very famous place where it says, in general, why is the halacha like Beis Hillel, right? It says because noichim ve'aluvim hayu, right? They were very humble. How did they show their humility? When you asked them a question in Jewish law, they would always say the answer of Shammai before their own, right? And because of this, even though the Talmud explicitly says that Shammai was machadedin tfei, Shammai had a sharper, incisive understanding of Judaism. The house of Shammai was more intellectually profound, but because the house of Hillel was humble and placed the view of Shammai before their own, the halacha was like them. Bizarre Gemara, right? If you believe that halacha is determined by rational intellect, the Gemara makes no sense. It's a very difficult Gemara, right? Because the fact of the matter is that Shammai was more right intellectually, if you believe the Gemara, right? In other words, Shammai makes the better argument. Shammai is more intellectually and rationally correct, right? The halacha is like Beis Hillel for non-intellectual reasons, it would seem, right?
No, there is a reason there.
Yeah.
That the nation was not ready for that.
Sorry?
People could not apply what am I saying?
That is not what this piece of Gemara says. You have a point.
Shammai's point was a different state of the world, right?
The time of Mashiach.
Yes.
I can't really argue with the Kabbalists from the simple text of the Gemara, but I would attempt to tell you that that's not what this Gemara says. This Gemara doesn't say that, although you're right, that Shammai has a messianic view of reality. On the contrary, I'm explaining to you why he had a messianic view of reality. Maybe that will make it easier to swallow. The Gemara says, that's not what the Gemara says. The Gemara says Shammai is more incisive. They have a deeper intellectual understanding. The halacha is like Beis Hillel because they're humble. That's what the Gemara says. I'm just telling you what the Gemara says, right? In other words, if you read just this Gemara, set aside everything else we know. If you read just this Gemara, Shammai has a better argument, but nevertheless, the law is like Hillel, right? For seemingly moral reasons, not intellectual reasons, right? But the truth is I think the things are related for the simple reason that we have a concept called intellectual humility, right? Intellectual humility. Intellectual humility means being willing to say, maybe I don't understand it entirely, right? It's where humility and rationality meet, right? Now, the truth is I still don't think the Gemara is talking about intellectual humility. Humility. Intellectual humidity is what we have in Atlanta. I still don't think the Gemara is talking about intellectual humility. Why? Because at the end of the day, it says Shammai was smarter, right? In other words, if Shammai is really smarter in a way that the Gemara says they're smarter, right? They would have been open to opposing views enough to get to the truth, right? I don't think that was an issue necessarily of Beis Shammai, right? So in other words, the question remains, so why is halacha associated with humility? It's for the same reason that Avram's arguments, he trusted his own arguments over the arguments of the idolaters, and he was being rational. Because the truth is that in Judaism, right, we believe that the core of intellect is what we call in Chassidus bittul. The core of intellect, despite its outward appearance of being, of discursive intellect, of being a very, a thing of a certain shape and a certain form that is either correct or incorrect, right? Chassidus and Kabbalah explain that that's all what we call bina. That's all what we call the level of intellect called understanding. But the core of intellect, beneath bina, and the only way that bina, that discursive intellect, that arguments like Talmudic arguments or arguments like Avram's argument for God, the only way you can know they're correct is through chachma. And chachma, which we normally translate as wisdom, which is the font and the wellspring of all intellect, the infinitesimal point from which the river of intellect flows, as the Mitzler Rebbe describes it, right? So the wellspring is one drop at a time. And from that, the whole river comes in all of its dimensionality and its three dimensions, and its erech, and rechev, and emek, right? It all starts from a single point in the wellspring, right? It comes out one drop, right? That drop is chachma. Right? What is chachma? What is wisdom? Right? For lack of, we don't have any time to explain it. The answer is it's bittul. Right? It's bittul. It's a sense in intellect of the limits of intellect. That's really what chachma is. Right? If the mind doesn't have a sense of its limits, of what the mind cannot know, the mind inevitably makes mistakes. And the kicker is, the bottom line is, this is not in opposition to understanding things. This is the core of understanding things. In other words, it's not in opposition to being mecheded in tfei, to being more intellectually incisive, like the house of Shammai, that you could be humble like the house of Hillel. The two are not in contradiction, right? Hillel knew the deepest wisdom. The deepest wisdom is the wisdom that you do not know. And I have news for you. You don't need Torah to tell you this. In other words, Avram figured out on his own that the deepest wisdom, right, is the wisdom of knowing what you do not know. Why is that relevant to what we were saying before about whether Avram got it on his own power or whether he was influenced in some way to choose God? Because Avram was very careful about his thinking. And you can see this in the stories. I don't have time to explain the whole thing to you. We could do a whole other class, I guess, extending this one. But you can see in the stories that Avram doesn't just think, he has an intellectual humility which keeps his thought on course. That's what keeps your intellect from going off in the wrong direction. It's a moral devotion, not an intellectual devotion, right? The core of intellect is moral. Before you can think correctly, right, you have to act and be an honest, upright person with integrity and humility. And that is what keeps your intellect from overflowing its bounds, which is what happened to the idolaters. Chassidus says that idolatry, at its very core, the core mistake of idolatry is self-interest, right? Why am I thanking God? Am I thanking God because he benefits me? Or am I thanking God because he's God and deserving of thanks? That's the entire core mistake. Once it's to benefit you, everything goes, as we say in Yiddish, krum. Everything goes askew, right? From the initial self-interest and self-involvement, right? And Abraham's whole strength and Abraham's whole brilliance is not just that he found God. Before he found God, he found a deeper level of intellect. It's a deeper way of thinking about the world where it starts from your humility. I'm going to end the class. This is really the ending. We're almost 10 minutes over. I'll end the class with a story that the Rebbe told by Febrengen. Yeah, the Rebbe told a story about Aristotle. I'm sure I've said this in the Thursday night class before. The Rebbe said a story about Aristotle. It's the only time I think the Rebbe ever spoke about Aristotle. The Rebbe told a story. The story was that Aristotle was giving his lecture. One of Aristotle's books is Ethics, right? It's all about how to be a good person. Aristotle's philosophy was totally comprehensive. It's not like in other words, a philosopher in the ancient Greek sense had to have an opinion on everything, right? It's all one piece. It's not like you could be a philosopher just about God. If you're going to have a theory about God, you have to have a theory about what it means to be a good person. The two things go together, right? I'm just telling you how it works in Aristotle and Plato, etc. Aristotle, the Rebbe says, was giving a class on ethics, right? On how to be a good person. And he says that there's a certain behavior which is totally unbecoming a human being, which is below what it means to be human, below behavior that anyone should do, right? And his students one day come in, or like the next day, they come in and they see Aristotle doing the thing that he was describing. And they ask him, Aristotle, didn't you give a class and say this thing was abhorrent and immoral? And Aristotle tells them, yes, but now I'm not Aristotle. I don't know where the Rebbe heard this story, what the basis of the story is. I'm not here to debate whether this is a real story about the real Aristotle or even who the real Aristotle was in general. It's an interesting question. The point is the Rebbe was making a point, right? The Rebbe was making a point. He was contrasting the way a philosopher thinks with the way a Jew thinks, right? A Jew does not have the option to choose not to be Jewish, right? It's an oath. It's a bris, right? It's a covenant, right? We made a deal with God and the deal is eternal. It's over. You don't get to choose. And in fact, even Jews who try to choose that now I'm not Jewish, the world doesn't let them forget, right? It's not in the nature of being Jewish. This is also the secret of why the bris is at 8 days old, by the way, and why Yitzchak is circumcised at 8 days and Yishmael at 13 years, right? The Jewish way in the covenant with God is not that you have a choice in it. It's key, it's core. Very uncomfortable maybe to our liberal sentiments nowadays, our individualistic sentiments. The whole purpose when they protest, when they have those crazy protesters who are against circumcision and they say it's mutilating children and they always say, you should let him wait till he's 18 and let him choose. It's like davka not, like you've specifically found the entire point of what we're not trying to do. Right? It's not a choice being Jewish is not a choice. The whole thing is precluded. It was a choice. It was a one-time choice. Really, it was Abraham's choice in a way, and in a different way, it was the choice of the people at Mount Sinai. And after that, it's all over for all of us. We have it's over for us. It was over before it started. There's no choice, right? A philosopher, and really this is the mystical point, right? A philosopher is only a philosopher when they are a being of intellect. As long as I am thinking my philosophy, I'm a philosopher, right? But it turns out there's more to a human being than thinking with intellect, right? There's other drives, things that would take your rationality and drive it towards idolatry, right? And that's why for Aristotle, it's not a contradiction, so to speak. And again, I don't know if it's about the real Aristotle, but it's for Aristotle, the idea of Aristotle, it's not a contradiction to do this terrible thing that you were describing as terrible because you're not a philosopher now. It's not your whole being, right? And even if you argue that it's the human's whole being, that argument itself was made when you were being a philosopher. In other words, no matter what you say, it's not who you are, right? Avram, so in a way it all comes full circle, right? The Jewish lack of choice, which was set in stone at Mount Sinai, was coming full circle from the beginning of Avram's intellect, right? Where Avram started his philosophical investigation with the approach of being honest and being moral and not taking these ways around philosophy, right? Or being moved by anything, but being totally devoted to the truth, so to speak, right? That's how Avram started, and it's what allowed him intellectually to find God when the idolaters could not find God. And in fact, the idolaters may have had very good arguments, right? But the fact is they didn't have this commitment, right, that Avram had to finding the truth in this sense. Many years later, generations later, that place where Avram starts comes full circle and becomes where all the Jews start, right? It becomes the foundation of Jewish belief in God, which is a faith belief, an inherent soul connection, a covenant, something that there's no choice in, right? So Jewish philosophy only existed for a very short amount of time. It's between when Avram set down his axiomatic beliefs to go and view the world and when the Jews said Na'aseh v'nishma. That was the era of Jewish philosophy, so to speak, most of which was spent as slaves in Egypt, building cities and making bricks, which is another thing for a different class. This, by the way, helps us explain just a little bit. This helps us explain just a little bit the answer to Eyal's question. This is really, really the final thing. The answer to Eyal's question was, how I understand bowing down to the sun or the moon is one thing, but bowing down to something you yourself make, right? The answer is not so stupid. It's not so stupid. What Avram's father could have told him, right? I'm going to give you what the Midrash could have said. The Midrash could have said, after Avram was being all cheeky and clever and saying that the main idol smashed all the other idols, his father could have told him, just for example, the idol is not the God itself, right? It's the form of the idol, the shape of the idol. It reminds us of God, of our God that we're worshiping. It has a quality of the God that we're worshiping because idolatrous gods have forms and things that a shape could remind you of, for example, whereas God himself does not, right? So in other words, it's not we're bowing down. We're bowing down to the thing that reminds us of the true thing, which is not made of stone, but is a spiritual thing, right? Right? It's not your misunderstanding. They would tell him, he would have smacked Avram in the back of the head and told him, you go to Cheder, right? You go to idol Cheder. You don't understand our whole religion here. You don't understand what the whole thing's about. You think we're actually bowing down to the thing. Everyone knows they can't move, Chacham, right? It's not them we're bowing down to. It's what they represent, right? Obviously. That could be in the Midrash. However, it's not in the Midrash. And the reason it's not in the Midrash is for the exact reason I'm saying, right? Because Avram wouldn't have sufficed with that answer. Avram would have said, well, then why should I bow down to this one rather than that one, so to speak, right? Avram was driven for the truth, right? Simple answers did not satisfy him. And what drove him and forced him to go beyond these limitations and beyond these forms, right? What drove him was his integrity. It was a moral thing first, which he himself gained this moral clarity on his own, and then this intellectual investigation. Those answers would not have satisfied Avram, although they do make idolatry sound less stupid. And that's my entire point. My entire point is that it's not that idolatry was stupid. That's not the point of all these stories, right? It's not that idolatry was stupid. He has a whole debate with Nimrod, and Nimrod is trying to make points, right? And you can tell from Avram's answer that his answers are all answering a particular defense of idolatry, right? There's depth to it. There's depth. The reason people worshipped idols was not because they were stupid. It was because they were very spiritual. It was because they were sensitive, right? When you see a beautiful sunset, why don't you feel like you should worship it, right? And the answer is because you're less spiritual than the idolaters in the time of Avram, right? Avram was only able to see his way through that, not through sheer intellectual gymnastics, but through a moral commitment. That's the bottom line. And that moral commitment is now at the beginning of the entire Jewish relationship with God. We start with the moral commitment to being Jewish. That's where we start. And then after that, we have the intellectual understanding. So in a way, you say that Avram, even at the beginning, even before God speaks to him, Avram really was the the first Jew. He had both components, I would argue, even from the beginning. This class has been a combination of several different talks of the Rebbe and a little bit of my own thing. So if there's anything in here that was stupid, that was the part that that came from me. All right.